we see a framing that it's too expensive to deal with climate change, and that the policies that need some investment, because we do need investment in things that will address climate change, are too expensive. And so we wanted to show actually these costs are already piling up on people. What we cannot afford is not to deal with climate change and nature loss.
If all we do is defensive and reactive adaptation, then we are on balance making things worse. Of course, there's going to have to be some hard flood defences in some places. Of course, some of those things are going to need to be funded, etc. But we cannot place, in relation to flooding, we cannot place the full emphasis only on those things.
Hey, it's me, Richard Delavan, here at wickedproblems.earth. Welcome back. That was Lydia Collas from Green Alliance and Rupert Reed, friend of the show, of Climate Majority Project. And we're talking this week about adaptation. We're talking to you now on Friday morning, 2nd of May. And we're also just looking at some of the results coming in from the local elections here in the UK, where in some of the most climate at-risk areas in the world, just elected a climate-denying mayor and a vast majority of the seats that were open on its county council. So that'll be interesting. We'll come back to how some of that unfolded in a later episode about the intervention of the Tony Blair Institute, which will also feature Adam Bell of Stonehaven, Dave Vedder of Forbes, and as a special bonus, another person from Green Alliance, Holly Brazier-Tope, as their director of politics, who can help try to unpack the vibe shift stuff we seem to be seeing spread across the Atlantic here this week. But this week we also saw the Climate Change Committee drop its statutorily required, its first progress report on adaptation, and it is not good.
Our assessment looks at two things. Firstly, evidence of delivery and implementation of adaptation. Secondly, whether there are high-quality government policies and plans to support adaptation across society. In our assessment of adaptation delivery and implementation, our conclusion is clear that adaptation implementation remains inadequate in the UK. We do not find a single outcome across all areas with evidence of good delivery on adaptation. Progress is either too slow, has stalled, or is heading in the wrong direction.
So we cover that with Rupert Reed in terms of like what his reaction has been. It's a massive report. We do hope at some point to get someone from the Climate Change Committee on to talk through it on the adaptation side. And also talked with Lydia Collas about some analysis that they've done on this they put on the conservative side, showing the actual financial household impact already being felt, just when it comes to food, insurance, and some other things here in the UK at the household level. So all that to come. And first of all, just want to say thanks for giving us your time, for paying attention, for coming along, watching, listening, reading this stuff. Just a little housekeeping. Next week on the 7th of May, if you're in London, the Climate Impact Summit, I will be going. You can get tickets still, a few of them remaining, at climateimpact.co. So do check it out. It's going to be one of the great events of the calendar of this year to get a vibe check on what's happening in the climate tech sector and climate solutions more broadly. And finally, if you are able to help us keep this going, at wickedproblems.earth, you can make a donation. You can sign up for the cost of a cup of coffee a month to help us keep this thing going. And any support you could give, we would really appreciate it. And of course, obligatory request, if you can, rate and review, hit like on whatever platform you're experiencing this. That will also be a huge help. So without further ado, here's my first conversation with Rupert Reed. So this is Richard Delavan. Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am just delighted to be joined again by Rupert Reed, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia, author, co-founder of the Climate Majority Project, and very much involved in its SAFER initiative, Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience. Rupert, welcome back to the show.
Richard, very good to be here.
And we're talking on the day after the release of this first kind of legally required report from the Climate Change Committee here in the UK. And they were evaluating whether or not, the new government that's been in office for less than a year has done anything to improve upon the resilience and adaptation strategy for the UK to cope with the effects of climate change. What was it looks pretty grim. Were you surprised?
Not very surprised. I thought this was going to be a really tough report on where the government stands and where Britain stands. But I was a little surprised. It was so harsh. It was so tough. I was glad that they made clear that they're profoundly unsatisfied with government progress on adaptation, and that, in fact, and this is a first, that they rate the overall level of achievement across all of these multiple sectors on adaptation, that none of them is the level of achievement good.
Yes.
It's really, it's very, very tough. They could have been even tougher in terms of talking about the potential results of this, the potential costs to the citizens of this. I think that they are, if anything, leaning on the side of being conservative and underestimating how bad the consequences could be in terms of heat-related deaths, flooding-related deaths, etc. in future. But in terms of their level of the assessment of government achievement, which is a very, very low level of achievement, I think they've got it spot on.
Because again, I mean, it's a long report, just a lot to get through. But yeah, there's like a handy report card, and it's color coded. I think there's entirely one green box in terms of policies, as opposed to actually doing anything, and the rest of it
Yes.
it's red or
Yes.
yellow or orange, and basically saying that like in literally every vector, in terms of preparing for the climate change future, that the government is just nowhere on this. And then they just talk a little bit about kind of the barriers to implementation, and what in particular communities face. I mean, it's something that you obviously decided to take a turn and work specifically in this area, and are setting up various initiatives to try to encourage local communities to be able to make themselves more prepared.
Yeah.
What are the kind of, I mean, does the report, to your mind, effectively address what those kind of barriers are to implementation of these plans?
Well, I think that the key thing to consider here is the simple, basic fact of funding. We know that you cannot get where we need to get on any of this without adequate funding. Now, the government, in its response to the CCC's devastating report, said, oh, look, but we're spending this money on flooding. There's 2 points to be made there. Firstly, the amount they're talking about, a couple of billion, sounds quite a lot, but it just isn't compared to the vast scale of the problem. I mean, the word problem drastically understates really where we're at here. But the other thing, and this is in a way even more interesting to us in this climate majority project, is that you've got to also look at what the actual stuff that is being done, that is being funded, is.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of what the government is funding in relation to flooding, it's virtually all old-fashioned hard flood defences. In other words, reactive adaptation, purely merely defensive adaptation. The amount of funding that is available for anything worth calling strategic or transformative adaptation is asymptotically approaching zero. And we think this is very bad news indeed. The Climate Majority Project, we're calling for a real emphasis on strategic adaptation, and that would have to be concomitantly funded. What do I mean? Well, if we talk about flooding, for instance, right, as I say, it's virtually all going into old-fashioned hard flood defenses. Where is the money that is going into programs of building social and psychological resilience to flooding and other hazards? Whereas the money that is going into networks of citizen responders or citizen science in relation to flooding? Where is the money that is going into the restoration of peatlands and wetlands? Where is the money that is going into changing upland land management or land reform, or making sponge cities? In other words, making the surfaces in our towns and cities porous. There is some, but it's an absolute, well, to coin a phrase, drop in the ocean compared to the amount that is being used for old-fashioned hard flood defences. So look, what's going to happen, Richard, over the coming years is that this amount of money that's being put into hard flood defences, an inadequate amount anyway, but this amount of money that's being put only into hard flood defences, those flood defences are in some cases going to fail. They're going to be overtopped. They're going to collapse, creating potential worse disasters than if you didn't have them. They're going to piss many people off and put many people off when they, for example, damage beautiful views and aspects in city centres, etc., which might sound a minor point, but you've got to actually think about how people live their lives and what makes life worth living, not only about making sticking plaster solutions to these climate reinforced modern problems. And when people start to realize that merely reactive and defensive adaptation is not enough, then more and more people will be pushing for strategic adaptation, for the kinds of things I was naming a minute or two ago. And that's what we're pushing for already right now. That's where the forward thinking, the horizon scanning needs to be here. And insofar as it is absent, then citizens need to try. It's very difficult, but to try, as you were implying, to press ahead now, to protect themselves, to protect ourselves, including in doing what we can to start to bring about, for example, conversations with large landowners to alter the ways that that land is being used upstream, ways that are contributing very directly to the increased flooding hazards that we face. And one more thing to add to the list that I mentioned, which is really, really crucial. Allowing rivers to be rewilded, to retake more of their natural courses, not building on floodplains. All of this kind of riverine management falls under the heading of strategic adaptation and, of course, ecosystem-based adaptation. It's very, very neglected. And I think that's one of the reasons why, although we haven't really talked about this as far as I can tell, although I haven't read the full report, I think that's one of the reasons why the Climate Change Committee are dissatisfied with what the government are doing.
Yeah. Now, I think that all makes sense. I guess one of the things I was surprised not to see, I mean, again, more head-on, a discussion in the report was anything around managed retreat, anything around the idea that, like, it's all very well and good spending all this money on flood defenses, or, again, even other forms of adaptation, but it's, like, there are just places where it's just not going to be economically viable to build those hard defenses, or indeed, like, we're facing into a whole planning cycle where we, what's happened before is you've been able to build land on cheaply, you'll be able to rather take land and build houses cheaply that happen to be in floodplains. And having to decide not to put them there is expensive, and that's not really a tune that the chancellor or anybody else wants to hear right now.
That's right.
So what is your
respond to that point, Richard? It's so important. So on your shelf behind you, you've got one of my favorite books, The Deluge by Stephen Markley. Of course,
we always try to give it a free ad whenever we do
it. One of the things about The Deluge, which is so good, like spoiler here for people, is that he does take managed retreat seriously in the latter part of the book as a key element in what it's going to be to put forward an adaptation plan. And we in the Climate Majority Project are calling for a serious adaptation and resilience plan for this country. What it would be to have a serious adaptation and resilience plan. It's at the heart of the transformation that is envisaged in the latter part of that book. And I talk about this more in my piece in Dark Mountain on The Deluge. Now, you are absolutely right. There is going to have to be managed retreat in the UK as well. And insofar as the government is not facing up to the need for that, they are abdicating their responsibilities again. And to put this back in terms of the concepts of adaptation, the crucial question of how we define and understand adaptation that I was talking about a few minutes ago, it goes like this. What the government is doing, insofar as they're doing anything, is merely reactive defensive adaptation, which basically tries to uphold the current system and defend it within, for example, higher hard flood defenses. That is brittle, that is fragilizing, it will fail, it's also high carbon. Part of the answer, obviously not the whole answer, but part of the answer has to be in some places managed retreat. And you can see, by the way, you can see the recreation and restoration of wetlands and of peatlands in some cases as being part of a kind of intelligent policy which can have all sorts of win-wins built into it of managed retreat. Managed retreat applies inland as well as at the coast. So yes, the absence of a serious willingness to engage with the difficult politics of managed retreat is very much holding the government back.
Yeah. And it is something that, again, the top report is 222 pages. I misspoke. The summary is 40 pages. Like I was doing some searches just to see if the words retreat ever appear in the document, and they don't. So again, we have a call into the Climate Change Committee to see if they have someone will come on to talk about whether or not I've got that wrong. Maybe they do address it in a different way using different language.
Yeah.
But anyway,
And may I just comment on that very briefly? So this is an interesting point. This is, again, one of the places where, as you're implying, the Climate Change Committee themselves could go a little further. And we do need to remember that they are constrained by their terms of reference. They're constrained in relation to what they're allowed to call for from an economic perspective. And they are not exactly encouraged to do things or to say things which will create radical or transformative agendas that are alternative to the government's agenda. So, yeah, I think that would be a fair question to put to them. Should they be taking up the baton more in terms of calling for deep, transformative and strategic approaches to adaptation and thoroughly ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation, rather than, as a superficial reading of what they're doing might imply, basically saying, look, you failed to resource defensive and reactive adaptation adequately? Because, to say it again, if all we do is defensive and reactive adaptation, then we are on balance making things worse. Of course, there's going to have to be some hard flood defenses in some places. Of course, some of those things are going to need to be funded, etc. But we cannot place, in relation to flooding, we cannot place the full emphasis only on those things.
Rupert Reed. So, sorry, we're talking about water, because I think it's something that you noticed in the report that they are very, very scathing about potential cuts to some of the measures that would be required for water resilience. What was that about? What caught your eye there?
Well, so Baroness Brown of the Climate Change Committee did something very unusual. She made a specific warning to the government not to try to save money, cut corners, make cuts in this area. She said doing so would be a huge mistake. She said, and I'm quoting now, "We are very worried about their spending review. This is not a tomorrow problem, it's a today problem. If we don't address it today, it becomes a disaster tomorrow." The CCC, being a politically neutral, government-affiliated body, never really does this kind of thing. Why are they doing it? They're doing it because there are rumors, and they may be credible, that the government is contemplating, incredibly, cuts in relation to resilience and adaptation, specifically in relation to DEFRA, specifically perhaps in relation to flooding measures. Now, I wanted to highlight this because it should be paid real attention to, as it is such an unusual move from the committee. And they've made this move because it would just be so absurd for the government to do this. Coming back to something else I've said, there is, of course, one reason why the government might be contemplating doing this, one good reason. They might be thinking, well, actually, these defensive reactive adaptation measures, they aren't as good as they used to be. They don't have as much academic respect, etc., as they used to. But of course, the answer to that is not to make cuts. The answer to that is to redirect the funding and fund stuff that is better. So what the government needs to be doing is to be engaging in strategic and transformative adaptation of the kind that I've described recently in this podcast. And they need to be funding that adequately. So in the CMP, we strongly back the CCC in its concerns about potential government cuts. And we say, do not make these cuts, but potentially redirect this money so it actually works better.
And then final question for the last couple minutes before we let you go is in terms of that financing. I mean, I guess it is something that, it's difficult to think about how I wouldn't envy, right, having to write a section in this climate in 2025 of a report about how to actually bridge that gap in terms of how you finance all this stuff, right? In a moment where, to say the least, there are some other priorities that seem to be begging at the government's trough. So the question is, like, how do you have a conversation, a realistic conversation, around some of these measures from a finance perspective, given that seems to be, again, creates the constraints under which, we can only afford X, Y, and Z as the imagined kind of view, and therefore talking about things that fall outside of that, there's no point talking about it. Seems to be like we're always stuck in these cul-de-sacs and these conversations. How do we get out of it?
So it's an important question, obviously. Here's a sort of sequential answer. So for the first part, we need to look for strategies that are investive. I mean, strategies where, at least over time, you're likely to get your money back or prevent losses. So retrofit is an obvious win-win-win, total no-brainer. Over time, retrofit clearly plays for itself because you stop heating the sky, you stop massive energy waste. Next, to generalize on that point, we need to look for synergistic approaches which bring together adaptation and mitigation. And insofar as the government is committed to a mission on mitigation, if it looks for synergistic approaches, and transformative and strategic adaptation approaches are synergistic in this way, then it will be achieving multiple aims simultaneously. Finally, and most importantly on this question, I would say, you've asked the question, the classic question, how can we afford to do this, or can we afford to do this? And I'm going to reply with the classic flipping of the question, can we afford not to? Right? And I'm going to make that reply and that new question quite pointed in the following way. So the government has, for example, a mission on electrification, renewable energy. That mission is absolutely vulnerable unless you take seriously a strategic adaptation approach. Any new and existing infrastructure for energy generation, transmission, etc., is vulnerable to the extremes of weather that are coming. Those extremes may include profound climate chaos or new weather regimes altogether, such as if we get a slowdown of the subpolar J, or worse still, of the AMOC current system. The national grid, according to our researchers at present, lacks any plans for ensuring itself against a colder future. It is planning for a hotter future. It has no contingency plans for a possible colder future. You see what I'm saying here? If we do not invest adequately and thoroughly and strategically in adaptation and resilience, then everything else that we do runs the risk of being wasted. Those pylons run the risk of being, for example, or those transmission wires between them, being pulled down in an ice storm or whatever it might be, right? We haven't even talked about wildfires, which again, the committee are scathing towards the government on, and which is a growing risk that we are horrendously unprepared for in this country. So I would say we cannot afford not to do this, because if we don't take resilience and adaptation seriously, if we don't get strategic about it, if we don't do what the CCC are calling for and more, then all the other good things that we're trying to do are at risk. And, to put it bluntly, at the end of the day, you and me, the citizenry at large, our children are at risk. We've seen in the last few days in the Iberian Peninsula what happens when you have a system which is inadequately prepared for potential black swan and grey swan events, and where there is little resilience built into the system and little redundancy built into the system. That should be a very well-timed kind of warning shot, a shot across the bows. I say, and I absolutely mean it, we cannot afford not to do this. If we don't do it, then sooner or later, and it might only be later, but later is still not ever, sooner or later, we will regret it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rupert, and thank you for all your work. Rupert Reed, co-founder of the Climate Majority Project. Thanks for coming back on the show. Hope to have you back soon.
Thanks, Richard.
Why are we marching hand in hand? Why are the ocean levels rising up?
So many thanks to Rupert Reed for that. And I have, moved outside into the garden for those people who can't see this and are listening instead. It's just too nice, and it's too warm inside, really, to be inside. So here we are. So here's my second segment interview coming up with Lydia Collas, the head of natural environment at Green Alliance, about the recent report that they just published. So, as the UK grapples with rising insurance premiums, food prices, and water bills, A new report from Green Alliance, the independent think tank here in the UK, reveals that nature loss and climate change are quietly but significantly driving up the cost of living. Framed around three household staples: insurance, water, and food. The report estimates from Green Alliance that environmental degradation is adding over £230 a year to the average household budget, released in parallel with the Climate Change Committee's damning 2025 progress report on adaptation. The findings strengthen the case for urgent nature-based investment. And in this interview, we're going to speak to Lydia Collas. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Okay. The report's lead author to unpack the data, discuss political obstacles, and explore what it will take for government to treat environmental restoration not as a luxury, but as an economic necessity. Lydia, Head of Environment at Green Alliance, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I know you're having a busy day, which is great to hear that the report has generated some interest. And so this report that you guys issued yesterday, so we're speaking on the 1st of May, it quantifies for the first time kind of how much nature degradation and climate change are already directly increasing household bills. So what made you guys decide to frame this as a cost of living issue, as opposed to other ways you might appeal to the public? And how do you see that changing the political or kind of public conversation on adaptation?
Yeah, we were really keen to put it in terms of costs to households because I think sometimes climate change and nature loss are seen as these faraway issues that will impact us more in the future or are not that relevant to people's day-to-day lives. And so we were really keen to look at what can we quantify as the impacts that people are already seeing on their household bills from these issues. And so we drew on existing evidence that was out there in terms of food bills, insurance premiums, and water bills, as you said, and came up with this figure of £233 a year added to the average household bill, which is almost certainly an underestimate. There will be other ways in which people's finances are being hit as well. We were really keen to do this partly because at times we see a framing that it's too expensive to deal with climate change and that the policies that need some investment, because we do need investment in things that will address climate change, are too expensive. And so we wanted to show actually these costs are already piling up on people. What we cannot afford is not to deal with climate change and nature loss. So that was the reason why we wanted to frame it in this way.
Okay. I guess, for me, yeah, I'm glad you said that because 233 sounds low, if anything, compared, particularly on food prices and some of the things. We get treated occasionally to, we don't hear about as, the lead author the head of the adaptation committee at the CCC said in her intro video for the climate adaptation report, which again is kind of the context in which we're having this conversation, that we had the wettest 18 months on record, which led to the worst harvest, second worst harvest on record. And then this morning I turned on the BBC Radio 4 Today program, and it's like, oh, isn't it great? The strawberries are really coming out this year because it's been so warm at night. And the dairy production is just over the moon and we can't really even keep up. Isn't that terrific? Which makes me I just want to throw my head into the oven whenever I hear that kind of thing. But it's so discordant. So 233, again, it's a lot for a lot of households, but it doesn't really feel like a huge amount. So I'm glad you said that perhaps it's an underestimate. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a second. But in terms of why are these costs happening? So maybe can you say more about, what are the drivers of that? You mentioned, in the report, land management, some climate impacts. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So what one of the big contributors is flooding. So when we're talking about home insurance premiums, that is the major thing that is sending those up year on year. We've just seen record payouts in the last couple of years because of flooding in the UK. that is also linked to how we manage our land. And when it's in a good state, land can be a really good sponge and soak up that water so that it doesn't flood downstream. That's also linked to the higher water bills that we're seeing as well, which the cost of treating water has gone up a lot because there's a lot of pollution getting into water, again linked to how both how land is managed, but also sewage is a big problem there, as we've heard so much about. On the food side of things, as you said, climate change is driving shocks to food supplies every year in different ways in different places. And whenever there's a shortage of supply, obviously prices go up and people end up paying more for specific products. So that's the way in which they're then seeing climate change manifesting through those bills.
Right. And so basically we're, so extreme wetness, right? Big rainfall leading to sewer systems overflowing, leading to then higher costs for actually dealing with the water treatment, which is part of why we have this, kind of meta crisis of, the entire water sector in this country, who, quite, once you lay it out in that way, understandable reasons, are financially struggling to cope with the cost of actually trying to remediate and mitigate some of these things in the water, and of course are again in the way of capitalist private sector companies are going to find ways to cut costs, maybe cut a few corners, and take their chances about whether they get into trouble. So, what response have you seen so far? About this cost burden, from policymakers, from anybody else? I mean, again, like I think you guys are laying out like I say, a very conservative case about the household impact. But has it resonated with some of the people who you need to hear it?
I think the time where we'll really see the answer to that is in the government's spending review, which will be published in June later this year. We're very concerned about cuts to budgets in that spending review. Obviously, it's a very difficult global context. And the government are making hard decisions about what they have money to spend in. But we're particularly concerned about cuts to the environmental land management scheme budget, which essentially rewards land managers for looking after the land in a way that delivers benefits to the public, whether through reducing flood risk, improving air quality, locking up carbon dioxide in those soils and restoring nature. Those are things where there will be cost borne privately from taking that action, but the benefits accrue to society more generally. And so unless they're rewarded with public money or potentially private finance, though that's quite slow to get going at the moment, they're not going to take that action to such a great extent. So that's partly what we're really aiming at here. And that's why we were so keen to put this framing on. It's already £233 a year. It's going to go up. We need to mitigate these problems in order to stop the escalation of these bills if this government is going to deliver on that mission to leave people with more disposable income by the end of the parliament, which is essentially what's behind the whole growth mission that they talk about so much.
So I want to come back to some of the risks if we don't do that. In addition to what how households might experience, because I think there are kind of longer term risks that I think you guys point to or gesture to in the report. But let's talk a little bit about nature-based solutions. So the Climate Change Committee's adaptation report, progress report, which again I'm not sure you guys had advanced sight of, but it seems to chime very much with some of your points about they lambast government for focusing on kind of like traditionally thought of like flood defenses and hard infrastructure as opposed to nature-based solutions. So you guys argue that they could be more more effective and cheaper. So why do you think that we as a country and as most of the rest of the Western world, we continue to ignore some of these options that you try to make the case for?
Yeah, I think there's probably multiple reasons why we've continued on a more hard infrastructure basis. I mean, when you look at the water industry, the regulation is just such at the moment that they can't use nature-based solutions as much as they can use hard infrastructure. So there's a key bit of the regulation that needs to be changed to enable more of the absolute huge investment that they make every year in treating water for more of that to go into nature-based solutions. I think there's also a challenge in terms of how the Treasury looks at numbers and the uncertainty that goes into a nature-based solution, and the lack of data has made it a more difficult case to make. Even looking at the data now, it's more site-specific. There'll be a particular example where a nature-based solution was used and it was very effective, and there's been some quantification of the benefit, but often it's based on avoided cost, which is always quite difficult to estimate. So I think actually some of this just comes down to the hard and fast way that Treasury look at numbers and decide what to invest in. But we are getting better at being able to demonstrate the financial economic value of nature-based solutions. So I hope that is now starting to cut through more.
Right. And I mean, so just to expand on the idea, the concept of nature-based solutions, just to say, expand more about what we're talking about, actually. So for me, when I hear that in the context of like, okay, we're in this broader conversation about adaptation, and I spoke a little bit about this with Rupert Reed earlier, where, we're talking about restorations of wetlands, riverine systems that are, rivers that are more allowed to run their course, and, kind of better management of peatland and other things that are going to basically allow for, again, like you said, both the carbon sink kind of function, but also just like the natural defenses against, kind of flooding or extreme weather or these other things, that are going to be beneficial. So my question to you is, like, what do you think, broadly speaking, and I think you kind of gestured to this in terms of like why we prefer, or Treasury prefers, talking about hard infrastructure. Like, there was nothing in the CCC's report, for example, on like managed retreat. There are like just some areas where it's not going to be economically viable to build flood defenses that are just forever tall, because they're just adding to fragility in some of these systems, as opposed to like, do you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have built on that floodplain. Therefore, we should probably move some people, which seems like a very difficult conversation. Is that part of your thinking when it comes to this, kind of when it comes to a nature-based solutions approach about how do we have these conversations? And I'm sorry, I didn't really quite prep on this one, so forgive me if I'm hitting you with a question you weren't expecting. But I do think it feels like, based on what you said, that's an important point, right? Is the idea that, are we really ready to have the conversations that we need to have about what's going to be really required to leverage these nature-based solutions, if it doesn't actually also involve some pretty hard choices about, economic decisions that were made maybe decades in the past, that might be pretty expensive to unwind?
I think one of the things that's prompted in my head, which may or may not be what you're sort of thinking about, is how people feel about how landscapes look and what they're up for landscapes looking like. We've seen so much about, I mean, solar panels is a completely different thing, but obviously people feel
Pylons,
so
solar
strongly
panels,
about,
sure.
and trees. It seems like at times it's a very emotive issue, the idea that an area will be covered in woodland that isn't at present. So I think, but often what's in the press is a very polarized view. We saw these stories a while ago about how Wales was becoming the net zero forest, and people were getting kicked off the land, and these forests were being created. And that's obviously, we need to ensure that communities have a say in where these things happen and that they deliver local benefits. And I think that's the important conversation in all this, is what are the things that you can put in place at a national level that then give local communities some agency in the changes that are going to happen around them. There's an interesting policy that where each all over England, there's been the development of local nature recovery strategies. And these strategies have looked at what's the state of the environment and nature in our local area at the moment. If we wanted to increase the state of nature, then where can we do that? And they've been big collaborative efforts. The first couple have recently been published. And what we've seen through that is that people get really involved in that and want to see change in their local area. The big challenge with them is there's no funding linked to them, so whether they'll really be able to deliver much, I'm not sure. But definitely that's been the big awakening in the last couple of years in the climate nature movement is the realization that this has been talked about too much in absence of how much it affects communities, and that absolutely needs to be a key consideration in what we do going forward.
So look, I mean, we've got a couple of minutes left. I appreciate your time, so I want to be respectful of it. I wanted to just maybe touch briefly on a couple more questions, if there's still time, that would be okay. One, as you mentioned, the environmental land management scheme, and like it's a key part of what you guys are recommending. So like you talked about the household bill risk. What are the other risks if government fails to fund or cuts funds, as some people is rumored they might be going to do in the spending review? If it's not funded at, I think 3.1 billion was the figure that you had, kind of pegged it at. What happens if that money isn't provided?
So one of the big risks is around the viability of farm businesses. When you look at what comprises the income of farms in the UK, generally those with grazing livestock are profitable because of public payments for the broader benefits that are being delivered through environmental and other activities on those farms. So there's a real need we know that we need to do more to reduce emissions and restore nature. And a key part to that is driving change on those farms. And without that budget, what's going to happen instead? What's the future for those farms? How are they going to be able to plan for that transformational journey of the future with so much uncertainty around their income? And that comes with a challenge as well around food production, and it's important that we're part of a globalized food system because that's going to be more resilient to be importing food into the country, but also domestic production is really important. We don't want to be displacing even more of our food production overseas. So we need to get so much smarter about how can we produce what we need as well as delivering on the environment. And that policy is the absolute centerpiece to how we do that. So the risk of losing funding under that is very concerning.
So final two questions. You mentioned about, in the report, the lack of public awareness between this, the link between the rising bills and, this degradation of the environment and nature. What do you think we should be doing differently about how we talk about this in public? You guys are obviously trying to make an effort in what you've already just published. But broadly speaking, what would you want to see more of from media, from policymakers, from, people who have influence, to be able to kind of like actually have conversations that are going to be really grappling with the issues that you're trying to highlight?
Yeah, so we did some polling as part of this research and found that 1 in 5 or 1 in 3 people thought that that these issues, that climate change and nature loss were driving up their bills. So most people didn't see this link. I think there's many different ways to do this. I think the thing is you just don't necessarily see the connections. If you're going into the shop and food is more expensive, it's not obvious why that's the case. So yeah, I think there is a role for storytelling through all means that we have available, whether it's the press and books and films and TV and all of that, those ways in which people receive their information, and to bring it so much more down to the impacts on people rather than framing this as some faraway issue. I think, what we're trying to do or be very cognizant of in our work is that MPs might not be being talked to all the time about climate change. I'm sure some are some of the time, but they will be hearing from their constituents about food prices all of the time. That will be coming up all of the time. So we're trying to, in our quite Westminster facing work, build that story around the issues that they'll be hearing from their constituents, so that it's clear to them why this agenda matters and how it helps them deliver for the people that they're representing, because that is key to tapping into their motivations for wanting to do things.
Exit question. So what is the number one thing you're looking for, in the spending review? I mean, if it's the ELM thing we've already talked about, great. But where's the threshold over under, they're serious, they're not serious? What if they don't do it in the spending review? Are you going to be like, well, we should now really push the panic button?
Yeah, I think the budget for the environmental land management scheme is our major ask out of that spending review. I think we think that it should be increased from the current 2.4 billion to 3.1 billion, because that's what evidence suggests is needed to tackle these problems. I think if it was cut from the current level, that would be a very difficult situation to then be put into, and we would be highly critical of a decision in that direction.
Well, Lydia Collas, Head of Natural Environment at Green Alliance, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Wicked Problems.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
She looked at me, I looked at something written across her scalp, and these are the words that it faintly said as I tried to call for help. There's only one thing that I know how to do well, and I've often been told that you only can do what you know how to do well, and that's be you. Be what you're like, be like yourself. And so I'm having a wonderful time, but I'd rather be whistling in the dark, 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 whistling in the dark. There's only one thing that I like, and that is whistling in the dark. A man came up to me and said, I'd like to change your mind by hitting it with the rock, he said, though I am not unkind. We laughed at his little joke, and then I happily walked away and hit my head on the wall of the jail where the two of us live today.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Whistling in the dark, whistling in the dark, whistling, whistling, whistling in the dark.